it's Miss Melissa from the Oosterhout Free Library with another American tall tale, more Paul Bunyan. But first, really good news. The library building is open. So come on in, and we've got dozens of new books for you. And I want to show you two of them before we get to our tall tale. Here's something different. JoJo and the Candy Kisses, the internet singer and dancer. We had a request for her. And then for the start of the school year, we have a book called I Love My Teacher. Now, our theme this summer is Imagine Your Story, and we're going to imagine how Paul Bunyan helped shape the American landscape. This one is called The Popcorn Blizzard. Paul Bunyan decided to go west. It was summertime, and the forest was sweet with the smell of green trees. The spreading branches cast their cool shadows on the ground. "We must cross vast plains," said Paul to his men, "where it is so hot that not even a blade of grass can grow. You must not become too thirsty, or there will be very little water to drink." Paul knew it would be a long, hard journey, so he decided to send all the heavy camp equipment by boat down the Mississippi River and across the Horn to the Pacific Ocean. Paul told Billy Whiskers, a little bald-headed logger with a bushy beard, to take a crew of men and build a boat. Billy had once been a sailor. In a short time, the boat was finished and loaded with all the heavy camp tools. Everyone cheered as Billy Whiskers and his men started down the Mississippi River on their long trip. Billy wore an admiral's hat and looked every inch the sailor, although he hadn't been on board a ship for 35 years. With Paul and Babe, the blue ox, leading the way, the rest of the camp then started across the plains on their long journey west. In a few days they had left the woods and were knee-deep in sand that stretched out before them for miles and miles. The sun became hotter and hotter. "I made some vanilla ice cream," said Hot Biscuit Slim one day when he gave the men their lunch, "but the ice became so hot under this boiling sun I couldn't touch it." Tiny Tim, the water boy, was so hot and tired that Paul had to put him up on Babe's back, where he rode the rest of the trip. Every time Babe took a step forward, he moved ahead 2 miles, and Tiny Tim had to hold on with all his might. Even old the big Swede, so strong he could carry a full-grown horse under each arm, began to tire. There was not a tree in sight. Paul Bunyan's men had never been away from the forest before. They missed the cool shade of the trees. Whenever Paul stopped to rest, 30 or 40 men would stand in his shadow to escape the boiling sun. "I won't be able to last another day," cried Brimstone Bill, "if it doesn't begin to cool off soon." Even Paul Bunyan became tired finally, and took his heavy, double-edged axe from his shoulder and dragged it behind him as he walked. The huge axe cut a ragged ditch through the sand that can be seen to this day. They now call it the Grand Canyon, and the Colorado River runs through it. It became so hot that the men were exhausted and refused to go another step. Hot Biscuit Slim had complained there was very little food left in camp. That night Paul took Babe, the blue ox, and went on alone into the mountains to the north. In the mountains, Paul found a farmer with a barn full of corn. "I'll buy your corn," said Paul to the farmer. So he loaded all the corn on Babe's back and started for camp. By the time he arrived there, the sun was shining again, and the day grew hotter as the sun rose overhead. Soon it became so hot that the corn started popping. It shot up in the air in vast clouds of white, puffy popcorn. It kept popping and popping, and soon the air was filled with wonderful white popcorn. It came down all over the camp and almost covered the kitchen. The ground became white with popcorn as far as the eye could see. It felt like a snowstorm until everyone was covered. "A snowstorm! A snowstorm!" cried the men when they saw it falling. Never before had they seen anything like it. Some ran into the bunkhouse and put on their mittens, and others put on heavy overcoats and woolen caps. They clapped each other on the back and laughed and shouted for joy. "Let's make snowshoes," cried old the big Swede. So they all made snowshoes and waded around in the white popcorn and threw popcorn snowballs at each other. Soon everyone forgot how hot it had been the day before. Even the horses thought it was real snow. Some of them almost froze to death before the men had put woolen blankets on them and led them to shelter. Babe, the blue ox, knew it was only popcorn and winked at Paul. Paul Bunyan chuckled to himself at the popcorn blizzard and decided to start west again while the men were still happy. He found them all huddled around the kitchen fire. "Now's the time to move on west," said Paul, "before it begins to get hot again." So they packed up and started. The men waded through the popcorn and blew on their hands to keep them warm. Some claimed their feet were frostbitten, and others rubbed their ears to keep them from freezing. After traveling for a few weeks more, they got ahead of the great forest they had set out to reach. They cheered Paul Bunyan, who had led them safely over the hot desert plains. Babe the blue ox laughed and winked at Paul when everyone mentioned the great blizzard. After they reached the great forest in the Rocky Mountains, Paul sent Brimstone Bill and Babe to the Pacific coast to meet Billy Whiskers and help unload the boat. They finally found the ship outside the entrance to the Golden Gate Bay. "What's the matter?" shouted Brimstone Bill. "Why don't you come to shore?" "I can't!" cried Billy Whiskers through a large megaphone. "My ship is stuck fast to the bottom of the ocean." That seemed very strange to Brimstone Bill, for the water was almost a mile deep out in the ocean beyond the Golden Gate. Billy Whiskers rowed ashore and explained. It seemed they had made a mistake when they built the ship. The men used new green lumber, and it quickly became water-soaked, and the boat started sinking. As soon as the water came up to the edge of the deck, Billy Whiskers would put to shore and build another deck on top of the first deck. When that became water-soaked, he would build still another deck on top of that. When he had finally arrived at the Golden Gate, he found he had 137 decks on his ship, and all but one of them was under water. Of course, with a boat like that, they couldn't go through the Golden Gate, and all the cargo had to be put on rafts and floated ashore. There they loaded everything onto the big blue ox and were soon back in Paul Bunyan's camp in the Rocky Mountains. Our last one is called Paul Bunyan Digs the St. Lawrence River. One summer, Paul decided to leave the North Woods and go back to Maine to visit his mother and father. When he arrived, they talked about old times, and Paul asked about Billy Pilgrim, the biggest man in that part of the country. "What's this Billy Pilgrim doing?" asked Paul. "He's digging the St. Lawrence River between the United States and Canada," said Paul's father. "There's nothing to separate the two countries. People never knew when they were in the United States and when they were in Canada." Paul Bunyan went to see Billy. He found that Billy Pilgrim and his men had been digging for 3 years and had dug only a very small ditch. Paul laughed when he saw it. "My men could dig the St. Lawrence River in 3 weeks," said Paul. This made Billy angry, for he thought no one could dig a large river in 3 weeks. "I'll give you $1,000,000 if you can dig the St. Lawrence River in 3 weeks," said Billy Pilgrim. So Paul sent for Babe the blue ox, Ole the big Swede, Brimstone Bill, and all his woodsmen. Paul told Ole to make a big scoop shovel as long as a house. They fastened it to Babe with a long buckskin rope. He hauled many tons of dirt every day and emptied the scoop shovel in Vermont. You can see the large piles of dirt there to this day. They're called the Green Mountains. Every night Johnny Inkslinger, who did the arithmetic, would take his large pencil and mark one day off the calendar on the wall. Billy Pilgrim was afraid they would finish digging the river on time. He did not want to pay Paul Bunyan the $1,000,000, for at heart he was a miser, so he thought of a plan to prevent Paul from finishing the work. One night Billy called his men together and said, "When everyone has gone to bed, we'll go out and pour water on the buckskin rope, and it'll stretch, and Babe the blue ox will not be able to pull a single shovelful of dirt." The next day Babe started toward Vermont with the first load of dirt. When he arrived there, he looked around, and the huge scoop shovel was nowhere to be seen. For miles and miles the buckskin rope had stretched through the forest and over the hills. Babe didn't know what to do. He sat down and tried to think, but everyone knows an ox isn't very bright, so he just sat there. After a while the sun came out and dried the buckskin, and it started to shrink to normal size. Babe planted his large hoofs between the two mountains and waited. Soon the buckskin rope kept shrinking and shrinking. Soon the scoop shovel came into view over the hills. Then Babe emptied it and started back after another load. In exactly 3 weeks the St. Lawrence River was all finished, but still Billy Pilgrim did not want to pay Paul the money. "Very well," said Paul, "I'll remove the water." So he led Babe the Luox down to the river, and Babe drank the St. Lawrence River dry. Billy Pilgrim only chuckled to himself, for he knew the first rain would fill it again. Soon it began to rain, and the river became as large as ever. So Paul picked up a large shovel. "If you do not pay me the money you owe me, I will fill the river up again," said Paul. He threw in a shovelful of dirt. He threw in another and another, but still Billy Pilgrim would not pay him the money. "I'll pay you half your money," said Billy. Paul picked up a shovel and tossed in more dirt to the river. "I'll pay you 2/3 of your money," said Billy. Paul kept throwing more dirt into the river until he had thrown 1,000 shovelfuls. "Stop! I'll pay you all your money!" cried Billy. So Paul Bunyan was finally paid in full for digging the St. Lawrence River. The 1,000 shovelfuls of dirt are still there. They're called the 1,000 Islands. So come on in and enjoy the library again. Check out all our new books, and we'll have another tall tale or fairy tale again soon. See you next time from the Oosterhout Free Library.